The dangerous roommate. The low-security psych ward wasn't as frightening as John expected. It was eerily quiet, with the faint hum of fluorescent lights and the sterile smell of antiseptic. The space felt like a budget motel with no escape. Plain beige walls, a squeaky twin bed, and a thin curtain pretending to separate the room into two halves. John, a man built like a linebacker and covered in tattoos, was here for depression. He wasn't violent or volatile. He just needed time to breathe. The first time he met Tim, his roommate, it was hard not to feel a twinge of pity. Tim was wiry, his clothes hanging loosely on him, with eyes that darted around like a rabbit's. He smiled nervously as he unpacked his things, mostly books about demons and religious paraphernalia. "You believe in the dark ones?" Tim asked one evening. John, distracted, barely looked up. "No, man, I don't." Tim's expression darkened. "You should. They're real. They're everywhere here. The nurses, the doctors, they're not who they seem." John shrugged it off. Everyone in this place had their quirks. Tim's just happened to be an obsession with demons. As days turned into weeks, Tim's behavior grew stranger. He muttered under his breath constantly, often glaring at the nurses as they made their rounds. His whispers were filled with words like possessed and sacrifices. But what unsettled John most was Tim's growing fixation on Jessica. Jessica was one of the few bright spots in the ward, a cheerful young woman admitted for anxiety. Her laugh was infectious, her kindness genuine. She often joined John during group therapy, and they struck up an easy camaraderie. Tim, however, watched her with an intensity that made John's skin crawl. "She's special," Tim told John one night. "The demons want her, but I won't let them take her. I'll protect her." John shifted uncomfortably in his bed. "You're overthinking it, man. Jessica's fine." Tim's face twisted into a scowl. "You don't get it. You're blind to the truth." From that moment, the air in their shared room felt heavier. Tim began pacing at night, muttering prayers and drawing strange symbols on his side of the curtain. He barely slept, and when he did, it was fitful and punctuated by gasping screams. The breaking point came one stormy night. Rain pattered against the single-barred window, and thunder rumbled faintly in the distance. John was reading a book when Tim ripped the curtain aside, his eyes wild and bloodshot. "You're him," Tim hissed. John sat up, confused. "What are you talking about?" "Satan," Tim screamed, his voice cracking. "You've been hiding in plain sight, pretending to be one of us, but I know the truth now." John's heart raced as Tim lunged forward, clutching something metallic and sharp, a crude shiv made from a broken bed spring. Instinct kicked in, and John blocked the attack, pushing Tim away with his considerable strength. Tim stumbled but didn't stop, his delusions driving him into a frenzy. John shouted for help, his voice booming through the ward. Within moments, the nurses and orderlies burst in, subduing Tim as he thrashed and screamed about banishing the devil. The next morning, John sat in the ward's small common room, his hands still trembling from the encounter. Jessica approached cautiously, her usual cheer replaced by concern. "Are you okay?" she asked. John nodded, though he wasn't sure if it was true. "I asked for a room change," he said quietly. Later, he overheard two nurses talking. Tim had been transferred to a high-security facility. During the search of their room, they found more crude weapons and a detailed notebook filled with plans. One page detailed how Tim believed he had to kill the devil to save Jessica and the ward. John's stomach churned. If he hadn't spoken up, hadn't asked for that room change, things could have ended much worse. As he sat alone that evening, staring at the sterile walls of his new room, the weight of what had nearly happened settled on him. He had come here seeking relief from his depression, but had walked dangerously close to something far darker. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, their glow cold and unfeeling. John exhaled slowly, a chill running down his spine. He wasn't sure if he'd ever sleep soundly again. In the end, the incident was swept under the rug, reduced to a footnote in the ward's history. But for John, it was a grim reminder. Sometimes, survival depends not just on strength, but on knowing when to act. even when the danger hides behind a smile. The abandoned psych ward encounter. On the outskirts of a quiet town in rural Canada, the remains of an old psych ward loomed under the foggy sky. The place had been abandoned for over 2 decades, yet it was alive in whispers and urban legends. For Brian and his friends, it was the perfect destination for a thrilling Friday night adventure. Armed with flashlights, phones, and nervous laughter, the 5 teenagers stood at the rusted gates of the asylum, daring each other to step inside. "This place is a joke," Brian declared confidently, pushing the heavy metal doors open. A creaking groan echoed into the night, swallowed quickly by the thick fog. The group stepped inside, their laughter echoing faintly through the decayed hallways. Peeling paint hung from the walls like jagged scars. Old, tattered patient files and broken furniture littered the floor. Every step they took crunched against forgotten fragments of the ward's past. "You sure no one lives here?" Lisa asked, clutching Brian's arm tightly. "Relax," Brian replied with a grin. "It's abandoned. We're the scariest things in here." But as they ventured deeper into the psych ward, the mood began to shift. The air grew colder, and the silence felt oppressive. A faint drip-drip of water echoed from somewhere above. Shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should. "Did you hear that?" Jake whispered, his flashlight trembling. A faint shuffling noise came from the end of the hallway. It was soft at first, like the scurrying of rats, but then it grew louder, deliberate. "Probably just animals," Brian said, though his voice lacked the usual bravado. The group pressed on, their earlier laughter replaced by hushed murmurs. They found themselves in a room that must have once been a common area. Rusted wheelchairs and broken gurneys lay scattered. The walls were smeared with faded graffiti and strange markings. "That's not graffiti," Lisa whispered, pointing to a set of claw-like scratches etched deep into the wall. Further exploration revealed unsettling signs of recent habitation. A pile of rotting blankets, a half-eaten loaf of bread, and a lit candle flickering faintly in a corner. "This isn't right," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "Someone's here." "No way," Brian said, but his bravado was cracking. A loud crash from upstairs sent them all spinning. "Okay, we're leaving," Jake said, already backing toward the exit. But before they could turn back, a figure emerged from the shadows. The man was gaunt and hunched, his clothes stained with what looked like dried blood. His hair was wild, and his eyes glinted with a manic intensity. He held a rusted piece of metal, gripping it like a weapon. "Visitors," he rasped, his voice low and gravelly. "You came to see me?" The group froze. Brian instinctively stepped in front of Lisa, his heart pounding. "We didn't mean to bother you," Brian said, trying to keep his voice steady. But the man stepped closer, his movements jerky and erratic. "They locked me in here," he said, his voice growing louder. "They said I was sick, but I wasn't sick. I wasn't sick." He raised the piece of metal, slamming it against the wall with a deafening clang. The teenagers screamed, scrambling to back away. "Run!" Brian shouted. The group bolted down the hallway, the man's deranged laughter echoing behind them. His footsteps pounded after them, relentless. They zigzagged through the maze of hallways, the building itself seeming to conspire against them. Dead ends loomed where they didn't remember, and every door felt like it would never open. Finally, they burst through the front entrance, gasping for air. The man stopped at the threshold, staring after them with a crooked grin. "You'll come back," he called out. "They always come back." Shaking and breathless, the group piled into Brian's car and sped away, leaving the asylum and its horrors behind. When they reached safety, they called the authorities. A search team went to the site the next day. What they found sent chills down the teenagers' spines. The man was a former patient who had escaped from a nearby facility years ago. He had been living in the abandoned ward, surviving on stolen supplies. Police confirmed he was dangerous, with a history of violent outbursts. For Brian, the experience was a humbling lesson. Bravery wasn't the absence of fear, but knowing when to respect danger. The psych ward remained abandoned, a decayed monument to both its haunting past and the terrifying presence lurking within. To this day, the locals warn against venturing near it. Some say the man is still there, waiting for the next group of curious teenagers who think they're the scariest things in the dark. The story ends as a chilling reminder. Some places are abandoned for a reason, and some dangers don't stay locked away forever. Trauma in a child psychiatric hospital. When I was 14, I thought I'd reached the lowest point of my life. I struggled with self-harm and skipped school more often than I showed up. My parents didn't know what to do with me anymore. When they decided to admit me to the local child psychiatric hospital, they said it was for my own good. I still remember the drive there, the silence in the car, the way my mother's hands gripped the steering wheel too tightly. The hospital was nothing like I'd imagined. Instead of a warm, healing environment, it looked like a cold, gray prison. The windows were barred. The walls were a sickly shade of pale yellow. The moment we arrived, my parents were handed a clipboard of paperwork. No one spoke to me directly. I wasn't a person to them, just a patient to control. My first day was a blur of clipped instructions and glares from the staff. They took away my shoelaces and any item that could be deemed dangerous. I was shown to a small, barren room with a metal bed bolted to the floor. The door didn't have a lock, not to keep me safe, but so they could watch me whenever they wanted. "This is for your protection," the nurse said. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. I wanted to believe her. I really did. It didn't take long for me to realize that this place wasn't about healing. It was about control. The staff weren't trained therapists. They were guards, hired to enforce rules rather than provide care. They monitored us like hawks, quick to punish the smallest infractions. Once, during lunch, I forgot to raise my hand to ask for water. A staff member barked at me to stand in the corner for the rest of the meal. I wasn't allowed to sit or eat. Another time, I laughed too loudly during group therapy. They accused me of disruptive behavior and locked me in the timeout room, a bare, padded cell where the lights buzzed relentlessly overhead. Time didn't exist in that room. Minutes felt like hours. Hours felt like days. The worst part was how they treated us like criminals. One of the younger girls in the ward had a panic attack after being restrained. Instead of comforting her, the staff shouted at her to calm down and dragged her away. Her screams echoed through the hallway. That night, I cried silently into my pillow. The staff rarely spoke to me except to issue orders. One day, a doctor I'd never met before walked into my room with a clipboard. He didn't introduce himself. "What's wrong with you?" he asked flatly. I froze. Wasn't that his job to figure out? After a few awkward questions, he scribbled something on his clipboard and left. Later, I learned he diagnosed me with a behavioral disorder based on our 5-minute interaction. It didn't make sense, but no one cared about sense in this place. A week later, during group therapy, I finally snapped. One of the other girls admitted she felt like a prisoner here, and I blurted out, "We all do. This place doesn't help anyone." The room fell silent. A staff member stormed in, grabbed my arm, and marched me to the timeout room. "You need to learn respect," she hissed, slamming the door shut. I screamed until my voice gave out. The days turned into a monotonous cycle of punishment and fear. The hospital wasn't helping me get better. It was breaking me. I stopped participating in therapy. I stopped trying to make friends with the other patients. I shut down completely. One evening, as I sat on my bed staring at the cracked ceiling, a nurse came in to give me my medication. Her hand hovered awkwardly before she placed the pills on my tray. "I'm sorry," she whispered, so quietly I almost didn't hear it. For the first time, I saw something human in her eyes. Eventually, my parents pulled me out of the hospital. They told me I wasn't improving and that they'd try something else. But the truth was, that place had nothing to offer. It took years before I trusted anyone in the mental health field again. When I finally met a compassionate therapist, She told me I didn't have the disorder I'd been labeled with in the hospital. Instead, I was struggling with depression and anxiety, things that could have been treated with kindness and proper care. The memories of the hospital still haunt me. The sterile walls, the indifferent faces of the staff, the screams of other patients. I tell my story because I want people to know what happens in places like that. Not every facility is like the one I experienced, but the damage places like it can do is real. Healing requires compassion, not control. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. People like me don't need punishment. We need understanding. The trauma from that hospital never fully left me, but it taught me something important. The mental health system is flawed, and we have to fight to make it better.